Hey there. Forget the fairy tales you were told. The truth is far darker, and somehow, if you let it, it can be quieter, too. Tonight, I'm going to lay 3 strange little stones in your palm, and you can feel their cold weight before you decide whether to hold them or let them slip away. First, a list of kings who did not rule for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Their reigns stamped into clay with the same calm seriousness as a tax receipt. Second, a flood so immense that it isn't described with drama at all, just one blunt sentence, like a judge's gavel. Then the flood swept over. Third, 7 teachers wrapped in fish skins, rising from the waters at dawn to hand human beings the tools of civilization, and then sinking back into the dark as if they were never here. If you find a little peace in this darkness, go ahead and leave a like. Subscribe if you want more nights like this, more slow footsteps through old ruins and older questions. No pressure. Just a small candle you set in the window. Now, let the room around you soften. If there's a light on, you can dim it. If your phone is bright, you can turn it face down like a sleeping animal. Let your shoulders fall. Let your jaw unclench. Take one slow breath in through your nose and let it out as if you're fogging a window. Good. I'm sitting beside a fire that doesn't roar. It only breathes. The flames rise and fold back into themselves, and every so often, a log settles with a small sigh. Candlelight trembles at the edge of the room, painting the walls in slow-moving amber as if the dark is thinking. And I want to take you far from here, to a place where the air tastes like dust and river water, southern Mesopotamia. Even the name feels like dry clay on the tongue. If you could stand there at night, you'd hear the wind first. It doesn't howl like a mountain wind. It slides, it drifts, it combs through reeds and grass, and the brittle skeletons of old mud brick walls, the way fingers comb through hair. The land is flat enough that the horizon seems like a line drawn by a careful hand. During the day it can look empty, almost bored, but at night it becomes honest. Shadows have room to stretch. The sky grows heavy with stars, and the rivers Tigris and Euphrates move like dark thoughts through the sand, cutting and returning, never quite satisfied. Somewhere out there, under layers of silt and forgotten footsteps, small clay tablets sleep. I always feel a little odd when I say that word sleep about an object, but it fits. These tablets were never meant to be loud. They were pressed into soft clay by hands that have long since dissolved into the same soil. They were dried, fired, stored, traded, buried, broken, repaired, buried again. Now they lie in museums and storerooms and excavation boxes, each one a palm-sized silence, stamped with wedge-shaped marks, like tiny bird tracks in mud. Cuneiform. That name sounds sharp, like a chisel, yet the marks themselves can feel strangely gentle. A stylus pressed, lifted, pressed again. A simple motion, repeated, becoming language, becoming law, becoming prayer. Becoming the record of who owned which goat, which jar of barley, which field, which slave, and becoming memory. In the late 19th century, when archaeologists began to peel the earth away from the ruins of Sumer, they thought they were about to watch humanity stumble onto its first steps. They expected, I think, the way you might expect a child's first drawing sweet, crude, full of mistakes that make you smile. Mud huts, rough tools, clumsy counting. That's the tidy story we like. A neat ladder, one rung after another. Stone becomes bronze, village becomes city, picture becomes writing, superstition becomes science. Progress, always forward, always improving, the way we tell ourselves it must be, because the alternative is unsettling. But the earth doesn't always respect our tidy stories. What they found in the windswept valleys between those 2 rivers did not look like a child's first drawing. It looked like a Blueprint. Cities like Uruk and Eridu didn't appear as messy little clusters of huts that slowly learned how to organize themselves. They felt planned. Streets and districts, temples rising in deliberate shapes, irrigation channels drawn across the land like veins, turning stubborn soil into something that could feed tens of thousands of mouths. And writing, true writing, appeared not as a long series of false starts, but as something startlingly functional. Within a short span, the marks on clay could record grain inventories and taxes, yes, but also hymns and legal formulas and stories that still reach through time and touch us. You know that feeling when you find an old photograph and you realize the person in it is staring back with a clarity you didn't expect? That's what Sumer can feel like. Not distant and primitive, but awake, watching. There's a particular unease in that. Honestly, I always feel strange when history begins mid-sentence, when it shows up already dressed, already speaking in full paragraphs, and nobody can quite show you the earlier drafts. Where are the practice scratches, the ugly prototypes, the mistakes carved into stone and then corrected? The silence around those missing rungs is where the story turns dark, not with gore, not with screams, but with absence. And then you open one more tablet, one more fragment of clay, the color of old bone, and you find something that tilts the whole room. A list, not a myth, sung by a bard beside a fire. Not a poem with metaphors you can shrug off. A list laid out with the same bureaucratic steadiness used for counting sheep. Modern scholars call it the Sumerian king list. If you've never seen it, imagine a small rectangle of clay, edges chipped, surface worn smooth in places where centuries have rubbed it. The wedge marks are precise. A scribe sat somewhere, maybe in the shade of a temple wall, while heat shimmered in the distance, while flies traced lazy circles in the air, and he pressed sign after sign into the damp surface with practiced speed. And the first line is almost casual. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That's it. No argument. No explanation. Kingship descended from heaven. As if it's as ordinary as rain. Eridu, the oldest city. The place the Sumerians tied to beginnings. To Enki. To the Abzu, the deep, sweet waters beneath the earth, where sacred power is stored like a secret. And then the first king, Alulim. His reign, the tablet says, lasted 28,800 years. Take a moment with that number. Let it sit on your tongue. 28,800. Longer than the span between us and the first pyramids. Longer than the last ice age loosening its grip. Longer than a human mind can hold as lived experience. And yet the scribe writes it with the same calm hand he uses to write down barley rations. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. Another ruled for 43,200. 8 kings in total. Before the flood, reigning for a combined 241,200 years. I'm not asking you to believe that literally. I'm not even sure what literally means when you're staring at a number pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. But I will tell you what I feel when I read it. It feels like someone trying to preserve something too big for ordinary memory. Like a child trying to draw a storm. And then abruptly the list offers a single sentence that feels colder than all the rest. Then the flood swept over. No epic description, no thunder, no moral lecture, just a boundary line, a scar across time. After that scar, kingship descends from heaven again, this time to Kish. The reigns are still long hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 years, but they shorten and shorten again, until eventually the names and numbers begin to look human. 30 years, 12 years, 50. And the strangest part is how the tablet refuses to change its voice. It doesn't shift into a different style to warn you. Now we are in myth. It doesn't wink. It doesn't apologize. It simply continues To the Sumerians who copied this list, who stored it, who treated it as something worth preserving, the pre-flood kings were not a separate category. They were not just stories. They were part of the same thread. So the question that creeps in softly, like smoke, becomes hard to ignore. What if Sumer's first kings were not inventing civilization, but rebuilding it? What if they were survivors of a lost epoch? I know, it sounds like the beginning of a conspiracy, but hold it gently. We don't have to force it into certainty. We can let it be a question, the way you let a heavy blanket rest over your body, without needing to know every thread. Because the evidence we do have is real. The tablets exist. The cities existed. The sudden sophistication is still debated, still studied, still argued over with careful hands and cautious voices. And the myths, those too exist, not as proof, but as the way human beings carry trauma through time. Imagine, for a moment, a world that ends not with fire, but with water. Not a poetic flood in a bedtime story, a real rising. Salt water biting into the edges of land, rivers swelling beyond their banks, coastlines vanishing. A village waking to find the familiar path to the fields has become a shallow lake that reflects the sky like a cruel mirror. People would run inland with only what they can carry, seeds and cloth, tools tied with rope, a child on a hip, the sick dragged on a sled, and something else less visible, heavier than any bundle, knowledge, how to plant, how to measure time, where the stars will be when the seasons turn, how to build a wall that doesn't crumble, how to make law out of chaos. If enough of that survives, even in fragments, then a new city can rise not from ignorance, but from remembrance. And that is the eerie tenderness at the heart of this story. Civilization as an act of defiance against forgetting. Tonight, we'll walk slowly into that idea. We'll follow the wedge marks into the oldest cities. We'll listen for the hush behind the numbers. We'll stand at the edge of the flood line and look into the dark water without flinching. And then, when it becomes too heavy, we'll let it soften again. For now, just keep breathing. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the weight of your body supported, the room around you safe. And far away, between the rivers, the desert wind keeps moving, and the tablets keep sleeping. And the story begins, not with a shout, but with a quiet, stubborn memory. Let me linger with you in that in-between space, the place where a question becomes a doorway. Picture a dig site at dawn, long before tourists, long before the heat turns the air into a wavering curtain. The ground is pale, cracked like old lips. A man kneels with a small brush, the kind you could use to dust flour from a table. Each stroke is slow, patient. The brush makes a faint whispering sound as it moves over soil that has been pressed down by centuries of wind. A trowel taps something hard, not stone, something duller, clay, baked. The sound is different, a quiet knock, like a knuckle on dry bread. They clear it, bit by bit, and a rectangle emerges, small enough to fit in two hands. It's stained with salt. The edges are broken. A corner is missing, as if time took a bite. And on the surface, those tiny wedges. I always imagine the moment the first person realizes it's writing. Not decoration, not random scratches. Writing. Your breath catches, just a little. Not because it's scary, because it's intimate. Because suddenly you are close to a mind that lived so long ago that your brain can't quite place it. The tablet feels cool, even in warm air. Dry clay has a way of holding night inside it. If you ran your thumb across the marks, you'd feel ridges and pits, little valleys where the stylus pressed and lifted. It's tactile, real, the opposite of myth in the way we usually mean it. And yet the words it holds can be mythic in scale. That contradiction, solid clay, impossible time keeps me awake if I let it. So tonight, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to let it make me sleepy. Because there's something soothing, strangely, about a world that is old enough to have ended already and still left behind a message you can hold in your hand. So as you drift, imagine we're walking toward Eridu together. Not quickly, not like an explorer racing for a headline, but like someone returning to a place they once loved. Each step sinks slightly into damp ground near the river. The mud pulls at the sole of your foot, reluctant to let go. Reeds hiss as the breeze passes through them. Somewhere a bird calls once, then stops, as if listening to its own echo. Ahead, the ruins are low, not dramatic like castles, just walls that barely rise above the earth, a geometry of broken lines. But if you look long enough, your mind starts to rebuild them. A courtyard, a threshold, a room where a lamp once burned. A man once set a tablet down here. A woman once leaned against that wall and watched the sky redden at sunset. A child once ran barefoot over the same packed earth you're standing on now, and laughed and didn't know that 5,000 years later, someone would be thinking about him in a dark room beside a fire. That's what history does when it's quiet. It turns strangers into shadows that feel almost familiar. And now, we take one more slow breath and we step inside. The first thing I notice every time I imagine Eridu is the smell. Not perfume, not incense yet. Something older. Wet clay, river reeds, a faint sourness that rises from standing water when the sun has warmed it all day, and then the night cools it down again. If you've ever walked beside a canal late in the evening, you know it. That quiet odor that says, life is here, but it's fragile. Eridu was built on a place like that marshland, flat and stubborn, a landscape that looks simple until you try to live on it. The ground shifts. Water changes its mind. One season it feeds you, the next it steals your fields. And still, someone decided to build a city here. I always pause at that decision. Truly, because it's easy for us to look back and say, civilization began. It sounds inevitable, like the sun rising, but in real human terms, it would have been a choice, made by tired bodies with sore hands. A choice to stop wandering, a choice to dig channels, to haul baskets of mud, to press bricks, to stack them in straight lines, even when the wind tried to undo your work every night. When I picture it, I don't see grandeur first. I see small movements, a foot pushing into mud, the soft suction as it lifts, the weight of a basket on a hip, the way someone's shoulder would ache by the third trip, the fourth, the fifth, and still they would go back for more clay, because the wall wasn't finished and the water was coming. And a wall is, in its own quiet way, a kind of prayer. Mud brick is humble. It doesn't announce itself the way stone does. It crumbles if you ignore it. It asks for maintenance, for attention, for a community that keeps returning to the same place and saying, we're still here. That's why Sumer's cities feel like willpower made visible. Even the silence there has texture. At night, you'd hear insects, thick and constant, like the land's own static. You'd hear water slipping through reed beds. You'd hear, farther off, the low murmur of people, voices not raised in argument, just existing, trading, calling to one another, a dog barking once, a pot clinking, a baby fussing, and then settling again, and above it all, the sky. Mesopotamian skies can be painfully clear. The stars don't seem sprinkled, they seem nailed in place. You look up and it's as if the darkness is a bowl turned upside down over the world, and someone has punched holes through it to let light leak in. If you stare long enough, you start to understand why the Sumerians treated the heavens like a ledger. Because the sky keeps accounts better than any human does. It returns the same patterns again and again. It marks the seasons without speaking. It doesn't care if your king is wise or cruel. It doesn't care if your walls are straight or crooked. It just turns And if you are a people living between two rivers that can drown you or abandon you, that turning becomes comfort. So imagine a scribe in Eridu, late at night, not yet the official with polished seals, just a person with a reed stylus and a tired hand. He steps outside. The air is cooler than the day, and it carries that faint mineral taste you get near water. His eyes adjust slowly. At first, he sees only darkness and the pale smudge of the river. Then the stars come forward, one by one, and suddenly there are too many to count. He feels small. Everyone does, under that kind of sky. And then, because he has been trained to do it, he begins to name what he sees. Not star, not pretty. Actual names. Actual categories. The wandering ones. The fixed ones. A bright point that appears near the horizon in the morning and then vanishes for days and returns again. And he knows it's Venus, wearing two faces, morning and evening, playing the same slow game it played before he was born. He goes back inside, kneels in the lamplight, presses the stylus into clay, and records what he observed. This is the part that always makes me uneasy, in a gentle way, like the edge of a dream, because the tablets we find do not feel like the first attempt at this. They feel like the continuation of a practice. They speak in a voice that assumes the reader already belongs to a tradition. When I say that, I'm not trying to sound mystical. It's just a mood you get from technical confidence. You can recognize it. If you open a modern manual and it says, "As you know," you can feel the invisible classroom behind that phrase. Someone taught someone who taught someone else. Sumerian writing appears in our record, already capable of bureaucracy and poetry. Their mathematics shows up already comfortable in base 60. Their city planning feels intentional, aligned with directions and stars. And the question returns, as stubborn as a heartbeat you can't ignore in the quiet. Where did the classroom go? Mainstream archaeology points to earlier cultures, Ubaid villages, Halaf pottery, slow experiments with irrigation. That matters. It's real. People were there before the great cities rose, and they were not empty-headed. They were human, inventive, observant. Still, the leap feels sharp. You can walk across an Ubaid settlement in your imagination. Small houses, low mounds, pottery shards, hearths. You can feel the domestic life there, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, the soft drama of daily survival. Then, within what feels like a blink on the scale of deep time, you're standing in Uruk with tens of thousands of people, workshops, temples, administrators, traders, arriving with goods from distant lands. It's like turning a page and finding the next chapter written in a different handwriting. There's a dark tenderness in that too, because it suggests not only brilliance, but pressure. A civilization doesn't become organized because it's bored. It becomes organized because disorder hurts, because water must be controlled or it will kill you, because grain must be counted or it will be stolen, because people must agree on measures or trade becomes war. So perhaps the sudden sophistication is not magic. Perhaps it is trauma making people sharp. Or perhaps, and I say this softly, as if I'm placing a fragile bowl on the floor, perhaps some of the knowledge was remembered from a time before. I want you to picture a different kind of survivor now. Not a lone man on a boat with animals. A group, a remnant, people who have lost their coastline, their homes, their sacred buildings. They move inland, traveling by moonlight to avoid heat, their feet cracked, their throats dry, their minds full of images they can't stop replaying. Streets underwater, temples collapsing, salt crust forming on once fertile ground. They arrive in a new land, where people live simply, where the fields are small, where the stars are watched but not measured, and the remnant has stories. Not just stories like entertainment, stories like instructions hidden inside narrative, because that's the safest way to carry a manual. when everything else has been washed away. Plant when that star rises. Dig the channel at this slope, so the water moves, but does not tear the banks apart. Count in 60s, because the circle divides cleanly that way. We treat base 60 like a quirky ancient choice. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. It's just how life is. But to choose it is to choose a mathematics that makes division easier, a system that plays well with the rhythms of the sky. It has a kind of elegance that feels taut. I've held that thought late at night before, the way you hold a warm cup with both hands. Not because it proves anything, but because it changes the texture of the past. Instead of imagining Sumer as the first spark, you imagine it as an ember kept alive through a storm. And then, in Sumerian myth, you meet the ones who carried the ember, the Apkallu, the 7 sages. They are described as wise beings who came from the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the world. In later art, they wear fish skins like cloaks. They stand beside kings and priests, holding a bucket in one hand and a pine cone in the other, performing rituals of purification, sprinkling, blessing, making order. It's tempting to laugh at the fish costume. It's tempting to treat it as pure symbol. But symbols can be honest in a way facts are not. If you've ever tried to describe a truly overwhelming experience, grief, survival, the moment a disaster hits and the world becomes unreal, you know plain language fails. You reach for images. You say, it was like drowning. You say, time stopped. You say, I felt hollow. Maybe the Sumerians did the same. Only their images hardened into tradition. Wise men coming from the sea, teachers appearing at dawn, leaving at dusk, knowledge arriving from water, then retreating back into water. I don't know if the sages were literal beings. I don't know if they were priests, foreigners, survivors, dreams wearing names. What I do know is that Sumerian culture treated knowledge like something that could be lost, and that fear is ancient. You can feel it in the way they buried tablets in jars sealed with bitumen, as if preparing for disaster. You can feel it in the way their myths obsess over the flood as a dividing line. You can feel it in the way kings later claim legitimacy by saying they restored ancient foundations, recovered old writings, rebuilt on primeval plans, as if to rule was not just to command, but to remember. So tonight, while your body grows heavier and your breathing grows softer, we're going to take a slow walk through one ordinary Sumerian night. Not a battle, not a coronation, something quieter. A night in which a temple lamp burns low. A night in which a scribe listens to water moving under the city, the way you listen to your own blood moving when the room is silent. A night in which he presses numbers into clay, numbers that might be practical, or might be echoes of a world that drowned. And as we walk, we'll keep that question beside us, like a shadow that doesn't threaten, only follows. Were they inventing or remembering? All right, let the fire beside me crackle softly. Let your eyelids feel a little heavier, and let's step deeper into the city, where the walls are mud brick, and the gods are written in wedges, and the past feels close enough to breathe. He walks through a narrow lane, where the ground has been packed hard by countless feet. Every few steps there's a shallow depression where water once stood. Moonlight collects in those dents like spilled milk, and the surface trembles when a mosquito lands. On either side, houses huddle close. Their walls are the color of dried bread. A doorway is just a darker rectangle in the wall, a place where warmth and human breath leak out in slow pulses. Somewhere inside one home, someone coughs. In another, someone laughs once quickly, as if remembering the night is meant for sleep. The scribe's sandals make a soft, grainy sound, not loud footsteps, more like the gentle rasp of leather and dust. He keeps his reed stylus tucked behind his ear the way you might keep a pencil, a small, practical habit that makes him feel instantly familiar to me. I like that. It reminds me, these were people, not ancients. He reaches the edge of a canal, The canal isn't romantic. It smells a little muddy. It carries bits of floating reed and a thin skin of oil from lamps and kitchens. But it is the city's throat. Without it, Eridu dries and cracks. With it, the fields drink, and the granaries fill, and the temple can afford to burn incense and pretend the gods are never hungry. He crouches and touches the water with 2 fingers. It's cool. The kind of cool that makes your skin tighten. He lifts his hand and rubs his fingertips together. Grit, fine sand, silt, the river's signature. His mind, trained and tired, begins to calculate without trying. If the water runs too fast, it will chew the banks away. If it runs too slow, it will stagnate and stink and breed sickness. The slope matters. The width matters. The season matters. Even the moon feels like it matters, because the moon pulls on water like a quiet hand. He stands, walks a few paces, and looks down the line of the canal, where it vanishes into darkness. I always imagine that moment as a kind of prayer, too. This human, looking into an engineered stream and hoping it behaves. Then he turns back toward the temple district, where the ziggurat rises in layered shadows, not towering like a mountain, but insisting like a staircase meant for something that isn't fully human. He enters a room lit by a single lamp. The flame is small, fed by oil, and it makes the air smell faintly sweet and smoky. The light wobbles. Shadows breathe. A lump of clay sits on a low table, fresh, damp. It holds fingerprints like a confession. He wets his hands so the clay won't cling. Then he begins to shape it, pressing the soft mass into a flat tablet. The sound is quiet, intimate, wet clay yielding, palms smoothing, the soft smack of material meeting wood. He pauses, not because he's unsure, because this is the moment where the mind reaches into the dark and pulls out order. He lifts the stylus, and the first wedge goes in. Press, lift. Another wedge. Press, lift. A rhythm develops, like a heartbeat. If you listened closely, you could almost fall asleep to it. The tiny clicks of the stylus entering clay, the brief silence as his hand hovers, the soft exhale through his nose. When a line comes out straight, he writes about water levels, about a measurement, about a date tied to a moon phase, about a star that rose in a certain place and warned them the season was turning. Maybe he's writing something ordinary. Maybe, somewhere inside those numbers, there's a memory older than this city, older than this river, a memory that survived a flood by turning itself into routine. That's the way trauma hides sometimes. It becomes habit. It becomes ritual. It becomes a list. Tonight, let the tablet stay warm in your imagination, as if your hands have been holding it for a long time. The scribe's lamp burns low. Oil thickens in the little bowl, and the flame narrows, then flares again, as though it's breathing in its sleep. Outside, the city settles. A dog stops barking. Footsteps fade. Even the canal seems quieter, but it never truly stops. Water always finds a way to speak. The scribe leans closer to the clay. When you're very close to fresh clay, you can smell it. It's not dramatic, just a clean, earthy dampness, like rain on dry ground. It reminds me of childhood, sometimes hands in mud, the pleasure of shaping something soft. Then I remember what he's shaping, and the feeling changes. It isn't play, it's preservation. He finishes one line of wedges and pauses, stylus hovering. You know that pause, when your mind is between one thought and the next, and you can almost hear your own blood moving in your ears. In that still gap, a question slides in. What exactly is he recording? Some tablets are simple. Barley, sheep, jars of oil, the dull machinery of survival. But others are stranger. They keep company with kings and floods and beings that come from the water. And here is where the list returns. That unsettling bureaucratic hymn we call the Sumerian king list. I want you to picture the list not as one perfect artifact, but as a thing that existed in pieces, Copies of copies. Fragments found in different cities. Nippur, Larsa, Isin, each one repeating the same skeleton of information, as if the bones mattered more than the flesh. At the top, the same calm statement. Kingship descended from heaven. It's funny, isn't it? How a phrase can be both ordinary and impossible at the same time. Ordinary, because it's written like a fact. Impossible because, what does it even mean for kingship to descend? You can't weigh it. You can't pour it into a jar. And yet, in their imagination, you can almost feel it. A sacred weight placed on the shoulders of a city, then lifted and carried to another. Eridu first, then Bad Tibera, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. The list moves kingship from place to place, the way a careful person moves a candle through a dark house, keeping the flame alive. That image always gets me, honestly. It makes the whole thing feel less like propaganda and more like fear. Because if you've lost a world once, you become obsessed with continuity. You become obsessed with not letting the flame go out. And then the names, Alulim, Al-Algar, Enmen-Luana, and Men-Gelana. The sounds are like stones in the mouth, heavy and ancient. The reigns are bigger than imagination. 28,000, 36,000, 43,000. If you read those numbers too quickly, they become nonsense. But if you read them slowly, if you let each digit take a step, something different happens. The numbers begin to feel like a code. Not necessarily in a secret society way, but in the way grief is coded into a family story. When a grandmother says, "Back then, it lasted forever," she doesn't mean the clock stopped. She means time felt different. She means the world was wider, stranger, harder to measure. I don't know what the Sumerian scribe meant. None of us do. But I can tell you what I feel. I feel the weight of someone trying to stretch a memory across a gap too large. And then that one sentence. Then the flood swept over. It's the quietest line, and it is the most violent. In my mind, I can't help giving it sound, even though the tablet does not. I imagine the first day the water rises not as a cinematic wave, but as a slow betrayal. A puddle where there shouldn't be one. A path that turns soft. A field that won't drain. The smell changes first. Fresh river smell becomes something sharper: algae, rot, the sourness of soil turning anaerobic. Flies gather. Dogs whine. People argue in low voices, because nobody wants to say the thing aloud. The water is not obeying. Then, the canals overflow. Not all at once. That would almost be merciful. Instead, the water creeps. It finds weak points. It seeps under thresholds. It pools in courtyards where children used to play. It turns a city into a damp lung. By the third day, the sound is everywhere. Not roaring, sloshing. A constant wet shuffling as water moves around obstacles. You hear it even when you're trying to sleep. You dream in ripples. And if the flood is truly great, if it is not just a seasonal disaster but a world-changing one, then the horizon itself changes. Land becomes water. Familiar trees become dark silhouettes, standing in a new shallow sea. A shrine that was once a day's walk away becomes a small island you can see from your rooftop. And you realize, with a cold little clench in your stomach, that the map has been rewritten. I've always found it eerie that the king list doesn't moralize the flood. It doesn't say the gods were angry because people were wicked. It doesn't tell you who cried, who drowned, who survived. It simply marks it as a boundary, as if everyone already knew the rest. As if, for them, the flood was not a story to be told, but a scar to be touched gently, then covered again. After the flood, kingship descends again. The list goes on. Kish becomes the new seat. The kings still live too long for comfort, hundreds of years, sometimes over 1,000, but the numbers shrink, like a lifespan shrinking after a fever. And the more the list moves forward, the more it becomes familiar to historians. Names that match other inscriptions. Cities we can excavate. seals we can hold, wars that left burnt layers in the earth. That smooth slide from impossible to verifiable is what makes the list such a quiet nightmare. It refuses to separate myth from record. It treats both with the same voice, so you're left in a twilight zone. And if you're anything like me, you start looking sideways at other stories, because the flood does not belong to Sumer alone. When I first learned how many cultures tell a flood story, I remember feeling not convinced, exactly, but oddly tender, like hearing the same lullaby melody in different languages. The details change, but the shape stays. A warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, animals saved, sometimes, a mountain where the boat rests, a bird sent out over the water, a sign in the sky after. In Mesopotamia, there is Ziusudra, and later Utnapishtim, building his boat because a god whispers through a reed wall. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah hears a direct command. In India, Manu is warned by a fish. In Greece, Deucalion survives Zeus's drowning of the world. You can argue diffusion. You can argue that floods are common, and the human mind repeats patterns. That's fair. But still, the similarity can make the hairs on your arms rise if you sit with it long enough. Because similarity suggests a shared pressure. Shared trauma has a way of making stories cling to certain shapes, the way wet cloth clings to skin. If sea levels rose drastically after the last ice age, if coastlines drowned and river valleys turned to deltas and people fled inland, then flood becomes not a metaphor, but a memory passed down like a bruise. And memory, when it travels across generations, stretches, it distorts, it becomes myth. The survivor becomes holy, the boat becomes cosmic, the water becomes the whole world, but the core remains. The world ended in water, and a few carried something through, seeds, tools, and perhaps knowledge. Now, listen closely to the way Sumerian stories talk about knowledge. They speak of the me, the sacred decrees, the principles that govern civilization, not invented, given, held, stolen, sometimes recovered, guarded. Knowledge as a thing with weight and danger. And then, those 7 sages again, the Apkallu. I can't help it, I keep returning to them, the way you keep returning to a strange word you heard in a dream. 7 wise ones, associated with antediluvian kings, described as emerging from the deep. Sometimes they wear fish skins. Sometimes they are drawn with strange hybrid features. They teach practical arts, writing, measuring, irrigation, temple building, law. They are not just philosophers, they are technicians. There's something unsettling about that, because technical knowledge is hard to mythologize convincingly unless you've seen it work. A ritual can be invented, a moral tale can be shaped, but a method for controlling water, a ratio for alloying copper and tin, a calendar aligned to the sky, those things either function or they don't. So imagine a people newly settled in a wet, shifting land, staring at the stars and the rivers, trying to build stability. Then imagine someone arrives, someone who carries methods, who speaks with the quiet confidence of experience. Maybe they are foreigners from a different region. Maybe they are survivors from a drowned coast. Maybe they are a priestly class. Maybe they are a story about the priestly class. They show you how to slope a canal. They show you how to press marks into clay, so that a promise survives the forgetfulness of human mouths. They show you how to divide time not by guesswork, but by the steady turning of the sky. To you, it would feel like divinity, not because they glow, because they know, and then they leave, or they die, or they are absorbed, and the memory of them becomes fish, skins, and buckets and pine cones, and an origin tale that says, our knowledge came from the deep. I'm not asking you to decide what's true. Truth is often too sharp for sleep. I'm asking you to notice the emotional truth in the Sumerian obsession with remembering, their insistence that kingship has a source older than politics, Their habit of pressing memory into clay because clay, once fired, outlasts flesh. It's almost heartbreaking, because it suggests they feared the world ending again, and perhaps they were right to fear. Even within recorded Sumerian history, cities fell, kings were betrayed, walls burned, people were marched away. The land that fed them could also kill them. If you walk through the ruins of an ancient city in your imagination, you can feel that fragility under your feet. Mud brick turns to dust, names fade, but a fired tablet, that can survive. A small, hard thing in the earth, waiting. So tonight, while your breathing slows, imagine the scribe placing his finished tablet on a shelf to dry. He sets it carefully, fingertips lingering a moment as if he's saying goodbye. He knows, maybe without admitting it, that the tablet might outlive him. That thought is both comforting and cold. He blows out the lamp, the room darkens, and outside, somewhere beyond the city, the river keeps moving toward the sea. The same sea that, in the stories, once rose and took the world. We'll follow that water next. Not quickly, slowly, like a dream following a sound. Before we go, let me add one more layer to the quiet. Sometimes I picture the modern archaeologist as another kind of scribe. Different clothes, different tools, same careful hands. A brush instead of a stylus. The same patience, though. The same respect for small, fragile things. In a trench at dusk, the air can be surprisingly sweet. Dust warmed all day releases a dry, almost bread-like smell. You taste grit when you breathe. The sun sinks, turning every shard and pebble into a tiny ember of light. And then a square edge appears in the soil, too straight to be nature's whim. They lift the tablet. It looks unimpressive to anyone rushing by, just a chunk of brown, a broken biscuit. But when you tilt it, the wedges catch light, and suddenly there is language, a human intention reaching forward. And the numbers, those impossible reins, are there too, pressed with the same care as a grain inventory. That's what gets me every time. The calm of it, the refusal to wink at the reader. The sense that the scribe did not think he was telling a fairy tale. So if you ever find yourself in a museum hall, under quiet lights, with glass cases humming softly from the air conditioning, and you see a clay tablet behind the glass, let your eyes rest on the marks, not to solve them, just to feel them, because each wedge is a tiny decision made by a hand that no longer exists, and the decision was made for one reason, so that something would not be lost. That, to me, is the darkest tenderness in all of this. Even when the world threatens to drown, someone still thinks to write. There is a soft cruelty in museums, too. The way the room is quiet on purpose. The way visitors whisper as if the dead might wake. The way the past is kept behind glass, safe, but also separated. You can't touch it. You can only look, and looking is never quite enough. I've stood in front of tablets like this and felt my own reflection floating over the wedges, my face layered on top of a stranger's handwriting. It's an odd intimacy. For a second, you share the same small rectangle of space, you and a person who lived before most of your ancestors had names, and you realize how thin we are, each life, how quickly we pass, and how stubborn the desire is to leave a mark anyway. The water we've been following doesn't stop at the city walls. It slides past reed beds. It threads through marsh grasses that whisper when the wind strokes them. It carries silt fine as flour, turning clear current into a slow brown pulse. Then it widens, grows heavier, and the river begins to taste like distance. If you've ever stood near a river mouth at night, you know that smell. Fresh water and salt negotiating with each other. The air feels damp on your lips. Your skin cools, even if the day was hot, because moving water steals warmth like a gentle thief. Somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, the river meets the sea. And the sea is where old maps go to die. Tonight, let's leave the scribe's room and step into the planet's archive. An archive that doesn't use words, only layers. I'm always a little humbled by geology. History feels long to us, 5,000 years, 10,000. But the Earth keeps time in a way that makes human empires look like breath on a mirror. Still, within those layers, there are sudden scars, abrupt shifts, a cold line that says, something happened. Around 12,800 years ago, the world was warming after the last ice age, and then it snapped back into cold. Not slowly, not politely. It was as if someone pulled a heavy blanket over the northern hemisphere. Temperatures dropped, storms changed their paths, ecosystems tightened like muscles in shock. This period has a name, Younger Dryas, and even the name sounds like dry reeds underfoot. I'm not going to overwhelm you with dates, but I want you to feel the shape of it, warming, then a sharp return to winter. Then, around 11,600 years ago, another sharp turn, warming again. Fast. When you imagine that kind of flip, try not to picture a neat graph. Picture people. Picture their skin. A hunter wakes one morning and the air bites harder than it did the week before. The breath in his chest feels thinner. He wraps his cloak tighter, and the fur smells like smoke and old sweat. He looks out over a familiar valley and sees frost where there shouldn't be frost. The animals move differently. They are tense. They travel farther. Over years, the landscape shifts. Rivers change their moods. Glaciers, which had been retreating, hesitate, then push forward. The world becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is one of the oldest kinds of terror. Then, when the cold finally breaks, when the warmth returns, it doesn't arrive like spring. It arrives like flood. Ice that has been held in place for millennia begins to fail. Meltwater gathers. Lakes form behind fragile walls of ice and sediment. And when those walls collapse, the release is not a gentle stream. It is a tearing. Imagine standing on high ground and hearing, far away, a sound you cannot place at first. Not thunder, not wind. A deep, continuous roar, like the earth is exhaling after holding its breath too long. Then the horizon changes. A line of water appears where there was land. It moves with purpose, carrying trees, stones, bodies of animals, whatever is in its path. Even if you survive that first rush, something else happens slowly afterward, and it may be the more important part for our story. Sea levels rise, not overnight, but across centuries that still feel like a blink in geologic time. If the oceans climb by tens of meters, coastlines retreat, bays swallow villages, river valleys become estuaries, the places humans love to live, flat, fertile deltas, sheltered coasts slip underwater, and with them slip the traces of whatever people built there. This is where the lost epoch idea begins to feel less like fantasy and more like a haunting possibility. Because if there were communities along now, submerged, shores, if they had boats, if they traded, if they watched the sky from stable coastal plains, then their homes are not in museums. They are under the sea. I don't know about you, but that thought always gives me a quiet chill. Not the sensational chill of Atlantis, but the ordinary chill of imagining someone's hearth drowned, their pottery scattered in darkness, their children's footprints filled with sand. And when survivors flee inland, what do they carry? They don't carry monuments. They carry habits. They carry calendars. They carry stories. They carry the memory of how to do things the right way, because doing it the wrong way might mean death. That's the kind of knowledge the Sumerians later attribute to the sages, the Apkallu, the people who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Whether those sages were literal or symbolic, the idea points to something real. After disaster, the most precious thing is not gold, it's instruction. Now, in the last few decades, humans have begun to look underwater with new eyes. Sonar is a strange kind of sight. It is sound used as light. You send a pulse into darkness and wait for the echo. The ocean answers in shapes. Off different coasts, India, Japan, the Mediterranean people have reported geometric forms, lines, and terraces that look, from certain angles, like human intention. Some of these claims are controversial, and I like to be honest about that. Natural geology can make convincing illusions. Erosion can carve stair-like shapes. Our minds love patterns. Still, the sea has hidden so much that the responsible attitude, to me, is not ridicule, but patience. Because even without dramatic ruins, we already know the basic fact. The ocean swallowed land, and humans were on that land. So the question becomes softer and more unsettling. What did we lose without even noticing? There is another place the story touches that makes the loss feel sharper. Göbekli Tepe. I'm going to say its name slowly because it deserves it. Göbekli Tepe, a hill in southeastern Turkey, a site dated to around 9,600 BCE, give or take, where massive carved stone pillars stand in circles like frozen dancers. When I first saw photographs of it, I felt an odd embarrassment. Not for the builders, for myself, because the site refuses the lazy image of primitive humans. The pillars are heavy. The carvings are deliberate. Foxes, snakes, birds, boars, animals rendered with a sharpness of observation that feels almost intimate. And here is the dark tenderness. According to the usual timeline, these builders were not supposed to have pottery yet. Not supposed to have full agriculture. Not supposed to have cities. Yet they organized labor. They quarried stone. They transported it. They carved it with patience. They gathered people around a ritual center. And ritual centers are, in a way, proto-cities. They are places where memory concentrates. Sometimes I wonder quietly, without needing to prove it, whether such sites are what remain after bigger things are gone. Not necessarily a global civilization. Not necessarily skyscrapers. Just older networks of knowledge and coordination that we underestimate because their materials were perishable. Wood rots. Cloth vanishes. Mud brick melts back into soil. Stone remains. So we look at stone and call it the beginning, when it might only be what survived. Now, let's take this feeling and place it back in Mesopotamia. If people carried traditions inland after waters rose, it could explain why Sumer seems to arrive awake. It could explain why writing appears quickly, why math seems already systematized, why the calendar is already married to the sky. Not because aliens dropped it from the heavens, but because humans carried it through catastrophe, the way you carry a candle through a storm. Cupped hands, hunched shoulders, eyes watering, refusing to let the flame die. That image keeps returning for me. It's so human, so tired, so brave, and yet catastrophe does not make saints. It makes survivors. Survivors can be generous, teaching what they know. Survivors can also be controlling, hoarding knowledge, because knowledge is power, and power feels like safety. This is where the story turns darker, even if we speak softly. Imagine a small group who remembers how to measure the stars, how to predict seasons, how to build canals that won't collapse. They arrive among people who do not have those methods yet. Immediately, they are valuable. People feed them. People listen. And if those survivors are frightened, if they believe another flood might come, another winter, another collapse, they might insist on strict order. They might demand temples, rituals, obedience. They might wrap their knowledge in sacred language so that it cannot be questioned. Over generations, that could become kingship descending from heaven. A political system justified by an ancient trauma, a myth that says we must obey the pattern because the pattern saved us once. You can see how easily such a system could drift into cruelty. A king claiming divine right, a priest guarding tablets, a city punishing those who threaten order, the calm face of civilization, with a fearful heart underneath. This is why, when I look at the Sumerian king list, I don't only see numbers. I see a culture trying to stitch itself to something older, trying to anchor identity in a past that might have been drowned, and the earth beneath them kept the memory in its own way. Layers of silt from ancient floods, salt lines where seas advanced, buried shorelines now miles inland. The planet is full of quiet evidence, but you have to learn how to read it, and reading takes time. And time is exactly what sleep is made of. So let your breathing slow as we stand on an imagined shoreline of the ancient Persian Gulf, when sea level was lower and the Gulf was not a gulf, but a valley. Picture a river running where today there is water. Picture reeds along banks that no longer exist. Picture footsteps in mud that will never harden into museum artifacts because the ocean will later roll over them like a slow eraser. Somewhere in that valley, perhaps, people watched the stars. Not because they were romantic, because stars are reliable. Rivers change, weather betrays, kings lie. But the sky turns with a steadiness that can calm the terrified mind. If you know when a certain star rises just before dawn, you can plant. If you know when Venus returns to a certain position, you can mark a cycle. If you know the moon's rhythm, you can coordinate gatherings. This is why astronomy feels so central to early civilizations. It's not a luxury, it's a survival tool. And if survivors carried star knowledge into Mesopotamia, then the impossible precision in later tablets becomes less like magic and more like inheritance. Again, not certainty, just a way of listening to the mystery without forcing it to become a slogan. Now, as the candle by our imaginary hearth flickers, I want you to picture one last scene. A group traveling inland after the water has taken their coast. Their feet are sore. Their sandals are gritty with dried salt. Their skin is cracked from wind. They carry bundles wrapped in reeds and cloth. Not heavy objects, small ones. A carved bone tool, a stone weight for a net, seeds in a pouch, a little baked tablet with marks on it, or perhaps just a song that encodes the pattern of the sky. At night, they camp on ground that feels wrong, too dry, too far from the sea they knew. They light a fire. The flames reflect in tired eyes, and someone, in that firelight, tells the children a story, not to entertain them, to keep them alive, a story about water that rose, a story about how to count, a story about what to do when the world changes. If you can hold that image gently, you can understand why Sumer's earliest cities might have been built not as naive experiments, but as careful reconstructions, a rebuild after a loss, a second attempt. With old fear still humming under the bricks, we'll walk closer to that humming next, into the first cities themselves, where order was built out of mud and where the darkness of human ambition learned to wear a crown. Sometimes I imagine the diver, too. The surface is bright, the boat rocking gently, and then the diver rolls backward into the water, and the world muffles. Sound becomes thick. Your own breath is loud in your ears, a steady hush, 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 like a sleepy animal. Light fades with each meter, and the color drains away until everything is blue, then gray, then almost black down there. Your hands move slowly because the water resists every gesture. Silt lifts with the smallest touch and hangs like smoke. You can't help feeling you're trespassing in a cathedral of absence. Then the flashlight beam catches an angle that is too clean. A straight edge, a corner. You tilt your head, and your heart gives a small jump, not because you've proven anything, but because the shape whispers of intention. And intention is what we crave. Evidence that someone stood here and made decisions, loved, feared, built, even if, later, a geologist explains it away as natural fracture lines. The feeling lingers. The ocean is full of almost memories. Back on land, in the quiet of a library, you can feel the same almost memory when you read a flood story and realize your own heartbeat has synchronized with a rhythm older than your language. Come closer to the city now, but do it the way you would enter a sleeping animal's den. Slow, respectful, listening for the subtle sounds that tell you what mood it's in. Uruk, Eridu, Kish. The names feel like pebbles you roll between your fingers, smooth from being handled by so many minds. On maps, they look tidy, little dots. In stories, they look heroic, the first cities, the dawn of civilization. But if you were there, if you stood on the edge of the plain at dusk, you would smell a different truth. The city itself would not rise in stone. It would rise in mud brick, in reeds, in bitumen seams that shine dark when the light hits them. A city built from the same substance as the riverbank because that's what they had. No mountains of granite nearby, no forests of timber, just clay and water, and the human urge to stack, shape, and claim. That urge is gentle at first, practical. You build a wall because you want your grain to stay yours. You dig a canal because you want your children to eat. You raise a temple because you want the sky to notice you. But then, quietly, the urge thickens into something darker, because once you can store grain, you can also withhold it. Once you can measure land, you can also take it. Once you can write a promise into clay, you can also write a debt. That is where Sumer begins to feel like a sleep story, made of soft terror, soft, because it is ordinary, not dragons, not demons, just paperwork. I always feel a strange shiver when I think of the first ledger, a tablet that says, in neat wedges, that one person owes another a certain amount of barley. It sounds harmless. It sounds civilized. But in that single sentence, a new kind of bondage is born, the kind you can't cut with a knife, because it exists in marks and memory. Picture a young man, maybe a farmer, maybe a porter. He stands in the shadow of a temple storehouse. The door is heavy wood banded with something like bronze, and the smell inside is rich. Grain, dust, old straw, oil, mouse droppings. The air is thick with stored summers. A scribe sits nearby, legs folded, stylus ready. The scribe's hands are stained with clay, nails rimmed with brown. His eyes are calm, almost bored, the calm of someone who deals in quantities, not feelings. The young man needs barley. His wife is pregnant. The canal flooded wrong this season. He has a cough that keeps him awake, and he's frightened he won't be strong enough to harvest when the time comes. He speaks softly, respectful. He asks for a measure of grain. The priest's attendant listens, then nods. The attendant's robe brushes the floor with a whisper. Somewhere behind him, a bell or a small rattle sounds as another person moves offerings. The temple smells faintly of incense, sweet resin, trying to cover the sour truth that power is stored here. The attendant agrees. The barley will be given. But the scribe lifts his stylus, and the young man sees, maybe for the first time, that he is not receiving a gift. He is entering a contract with the god's house. He is stepping into a net made of numbers. The scribe presses wedges, a name, an amount, a date, perhaps a witness, perhaps a mark indicating interest. The clay is soft now, but soon it will dry. Then it will be fired. Then it will last longer than the young man's body. That's the dark miracle of writing, and I don't say that as an insult. Writing is beautiful. It's also merciless, because what is written can outlive forgiveness. In the world of Sumer, the temple is not just a place of prayer. It is a bank, a court, a warehouse, a calendar, a school. It is the heart that pumps food and order through the city, and hearts can be kind, and hearts can also squeeze too hard. You can hear the city's pulse if you listen. In the morning, sandals slap damp streets. Donkeys bray. Water is poured. Pots clink. Voices call to each other across courtyards. The smell of baking bread drifts out, warm and comforting, mixing with the sharper smell of fish drying on racks. Then, as the sun climbs, the work begins. Men and women move in lines, carrying baskets of mud brick, bundles of reeds, jars of water. They sweat. The sweat dries into salt on their skin, leaving white traces at the edges of hairlines, at the creases of elbows. Above them, the ziggurat rises like a dark-stepped shadow against the bright sky. It is not a mountain, but it imitates one, the human desire to make a high place in flat land. Its bricks are warm under the sun, and if you climb it, your feet feel the heat through the soles, as if the building itself is alive. At the top, the shrine waits, and inside, the god waits, or at least the idea of the god, an image dressed, fed, washed, adored. The god is never hungry in the way humans are. The god's hunger is institutional. The god requires offerings, festivals, labor, obedience. The god requires the city to keep moving. And this is where kingship enters, as both balm and blade. The Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven. In practice, kingship descended into the city like a new kind of weather. It changed everything. A king is a person, yes, but the office of king becomes something bigger than the person. It becomes the place where fear and hope gather. The king promises protection from enemies, from famine, from flood. He promises to maintain the canals, to rebuild the walls, to keep the gods pleased, and the people, tired and anxious, want to believe. So they give him grain, they give him labor, they give him their sons for war. War. That word is a stone in the mouth even when you whisper it. Mesopotamia was not one united kingdom in the early days. It was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own patron god, its own temple economy, its own pride. The land between them could be fertile, but it could also be contested, because water is contested. A canal is life. A canal is also a weapon. If you divert water upstream, the downstream fields dry. If you breach a levee, you can drown your enemy's crops. The same liquid that feeds can also punish. So imagine a king of Lagash or Umma, names that later texts will set against each other like opposing teeth. Imagine him walking at night, along the canal banks, listening to the water, thinking about boundaries. The moon is thin, the reeds sway. Frogs croak in a steady rhythm that feels like a drum far away. He stops. He squats, touches the wet soil. He feels the coolness seep into his fingertips. He looks at the water's surface, where moonlight trembles. In that trembling, he sees a map, not drawn, but imagined. Fields, dikes, laborers. He sees how much grain could be harvested if only the canal were extended a little farther. He sees how much tribute could be demanded if the neighboring city were weakened. And then this is the part that always makes my chest feel tight. He feels justified because he is king, because the gods chose him, because the temple needs offerings, because his people need food. Justification is one of the oldest poisons. It tastes like duty. So he calls his officers. He orders a night raid on a canal gate. Or he orders the stones moved. Or he orders the boundary stelae shifted. It's not always swords first. Sometimes it's engineering first. And then, when the neighbor protests, the neighbor is called a liar. The neighbor is called impious. The neighbor's god is called weak. And then the spears come out. Now, I won't paint the battlefield in sharp gore. Not tonight. But I will let you feel the quiet horror of it. The battlefield is not a grand plain. It is often a field edge, a canal crossing, a narrow place where men bunch together and push. The air is hot. Breath is loud in the ears. Leather straps creak. A man's hand slips on his spear shaft because sweat has made it slick. His heart pounds so hard it feels like it's trying to climb out of his throat. he sees another man's eyes. The other man is not a monster. He is someone else's son, someone else's husband. But the space between them is full of orders, full of priests' words, full of the fear of hunger. They collide. A spear finds flesh. The sound is not dramatic. It's a wet, surprised sound. The man who is struck makes a noise that is half breath, half disbelief. Then he falls into the mud. Mud, the same mud the city is built from. The mud receives him without judgment. It cools his cheek. It fills his mouth if he gasps wrong. The reeds continue to sway. This is why when scholars say Sumer was sophisticated, I always want to add sophisticated suffering too. Now, let's move into the temple during a festival. The calendar is aligned to the moon and the stars. The priest announces the day. The streets fill. You can smell beer, thick, sour, sweet, fermenting in jars. You can smell roasted meat, if there is enough wealth for it. You can smell crushed herbs underfoot as people scatter greens to freshen the path. A procession forms. Drums beat slowly, not frantic. The rhythm matches walking. It matches heartbeats. The king appears. He is dressed in linen, jewelry catching light. His hair is oiled. His face is controlled. But if you look close, you might see the tightness around his eyes. Being the symbol of a city is exhausting. He climbs the steps. Each step is a rectangle of baked brick, warm and slightly rough. His sandals scuff. The crowd below looks like a field of heads. The wind up here is stronger. It carries the smell of smoke and river. At the top, in the shrine, the ritual begins. In some festivals, the king is humbled, stripped of insignia, slapped or made to kneel. The priest speaks harshly, and the king must accept it. This always fascinates me, a ritual of controlled humiliation, as if the society understands that power needs a pressure valve. The king cries, sometimes genuinely, sometimes as performance. Either way, tears glisten. He swallows hard. The priest returns his crown, restoring him. The message is clear. Order collapses into chaos and is rebuilt. A rehearsal of catastrophe. A way of telling the gods and telling the people that the city can survive disruption. It's almost soothing in its own way, but there's a shadow under it. Because the ritual teaches obedience. It teaches that the king is necessary, even when he is flawed. It teaches that the system is sacred, and sacred systems can demand sacrifices. Sometimes the sacrifices are animals. Sometimes they are grain. Sometimes they are the bodies of workers who die building walls and temples. The ziggurat is beautiful. The ziggurat is also a monument made of countless lifted baskets, countless strained backs. Imagine a laborer at dawn, hands cracked, fingernails broken. He lifts a basket of mud brick on his shoulder. The rough reed strap bites into his skin. He feels the weight press down, making his spine complain. He climbs a ramp. The ramp is dusted with powdered brick, and each step kicks up a faint red haze that sticks to sweat. He tastes grit. His breath is steady, because if he breathes too fast, he will faint. He sets the basket down. His shoulder throbs. He looks out over rooftops and canals, feeling pride and resignation mingle until they are the same tired thing. So yes, Sumer rises. Writing, math, astronomy, law, wonders, but underneath, a hum of human cost. And still, the tablets endure. In later centuries, kings will boast of rebuilding ancient foundations, of restoring temples according to primeval plans. They will claim to have consulted writings from before the flood. Some of that is propaganda. Some of it may be genuine continuity. Either way, the claim itself matters. It tells you what they valued. Not novelty, but legitimacy through age. They wanted to be connected to the lost epoch, to the time when kingship descended from heaven. Because if you can claim that connection, you can claim authority over the living. That is the final dark thread for tonight, and I'll hold it gently. Memory can be a refuge. Memory can also be a weapon. A people tells itself, "We are the inheritors. We are the rememberers. We must preserve order," and the sentence can become, "Therefore you must obey." The clay does not argue. The clay receives the wedges. The clay becomes law. Now, let your body soften. Imagine the city at night again, after the festival. Lamps glow in doorways like small captured stars. The canal water reflects them in broken lines. Somewhere, someone sings a hymn softly, voice tired but steady. In a courtyard, a child sleeps, curled beside a jar. In a palace, a king lies awake, listening to the distant sound of water, wondering perhaps whether the gods will ever be satisfied. And in a storeroom, a tablet dries. It will be placed on a shelf among thousands. It will sleep there for centuries, waiting for a hand, much later, to lift it into light and feel, in its weight, the quiet terror and tenderness of the first cities. When you think of ancient law, it's easy to imagine it as a clean list of punishments, a stern voice carved into stone. But in Sumer, law begins as something softer and stranger, a set of habits written down because the city has grown too big to rely on memory alone. And yet, the moment you write a rule, you create a new kind of darkness, because a written rule can be applied without mercy. It can be copied, enforced, inherited. It can continue long after the reason for it has faded. Tonight, let's walk through that darkness with a candle in hand, not to frighten you, but to settle you into the slow rhythm of how systems grow. Picture the courthouse as not a grand building, but a corner of the temple complex, shaded by a wall that holds the day's heat. The ground is packed earth. Dust rises when people shift their feet. A faint smell of sweat hangs under the sweeter smell of incense drifting from nearby rituals. People gather in small clusters, murmuring. Some are angry, some ashamed, some desperate. A goat bleats in the distance. A baby cries, then quiets. A judge sits on a low platform. He is not an abstract justice. He is a man with a stomach that gets hungry, with a back that aches when it rains. He looks tired. He also looks careful, because being careless in a crowded city can get you killed. Beside him sits a scribe, always the scribe. The scribe lays a fresh tablet on his lap. The clay is cool and damp. He smooths it with a practiced thumb, leaving faint ridges like the wake of a boat in mud. Then he waits, stylus ready. The first case is simple, a boundary dispute. Two farmers arguing about where one field ends and the other begins. It sounds petty, but in a land where water is life, boundaries are veins. A small shift can mean hunger. The farmers point. They talk over each other. Their voices rise, then fall when the judge lifts a hand. The judge asks about markers, stones, reeds, a tree. He asks who remembers. He asks who witnessed the last agreement. You can almost feel the city trying to hold itself together through these questions, because without agreed boundaries, there is only constant conflict. The scribe presses wedges, names, measurements, a decision that will outlive both farmers. That's the strange comfort of writing. It stabilizes the future. It's also the strange threat of writing. It can trap people in decisions made when they were afraid. The next case is darker. A woman stands with her head lowered. Her hair is covered. Her hands twist a piece of cloth until her knuckles pale. She is accused of something. Perhaps adultery. Perhaps theft. Perhaps speaking out of turn. In these societies, a woman's body is often treated as property, as a vessel for lineage and inheritance. I say that gently, but I don't want to pretend it wasn't harsh. It was harsh, and the harshness wore the face of righteousness. The judge listens. The scribe waits. The woman's voice is small, but it is steady. She tells her side. Maybe she was forced. Maybe she was framed. Maybe she is guilty of nothing more than being visible. The decision comes. It might be a fine. It might be a punishment. It might be a ritual ordeal. Water again. Always water. As if the flood myth has seeped into the legal imagination. There are stories of river ordeals in later Mesopotamian law. The accused thrown into the river. If they survive, they are innocent. If they drown, well, then the gods have decided. When I think about that, I feel a cold tightness, because it's the most brutal kind of logic. The universe as judge, but the universe does not care. Still, I can imagine the people watching, holding their breath, the river's surface glossy, reflecting the sky like a blade. A woman pushed in, a splash, the crowd's murmur. If she swims, she lives. If she sinks, she becomes a lesson. And somewhere, a scribe records the result. The law becomes a ritual, and the ritual becomes a weapon. Now, step back and look at the wider pattern. In Sumer, and in later Babylonian culture that inherits much from Sumer, we find codes, Ur-Nammu, Lipit, Ishtar, early legal texts that outline compensation, property rules, protections for certain vulnerable groups. There is maturity there. There is an attempt at proportionality. There is even, in places, a recognition that not all harm can be repaid with blood. That is the bright thread. But the dark thread is woven alongside it. Law as a tool to protect hierarchy, to enforce debt, to control bodies. Debt is the quiet monster that grows under civilization's bed. At first, debt is mutual aid. You borrow barley and you repay after harvest. You borrow a plow and you return it. But then interest appears small at first, like a whisper. Then harvest fails. Then repayment is missed. Then the lender is not a neighbor, but a temple institution that cannot afford to forgive because it has its own obligations, its own priests to feed, its own offerings to maintain. So the debtor is taken, not necessarily in chains right away. Sometimes in paperwork first, a tablet that says, "This person will work for the temple until the debt is repaid." Their labor becomes currency. Their time becomes property. If the debt grows, children can be pledged. A son sent to work in a workshop, a daughter sent as a servant. In some cases, people sell themselves to survive. Imagine the moment of that decision. A father sits in the dim of a one-room house. The walls are mud. The roof is reeds. The air smells of smoke and sour beer. A clay lamp burns low, throwing shadows that look like moving hands on the wall. His child sleeps nearby, chest rising and falling, in the slow rhythm you're listening to now. The father watches that breath and feels his own breath catch. Outside, the city murmurs. Somewhere, a dog scratches at fleas. Somewhere, water moves in the canal. The father's stomach is empty. His wife's eyes are hollow. The grain jar is almost bare. He knows the next weeks will kill them if something doesn't change. So he takes a piece of clay, or he goes to the temple. He agrees to a contract. He trades a future for a present. When the scribe presses the wedges, the sound is soft. Tap, press, lift. Tap, press, lift. It could almost be soothing if you didn't know what it means. This is where I always feel the strangest mix of emotions, because I don't want to judge those people with modern arrogance. They were doing what they could. They were trying to keep their family alive. But I also can't deny the shadow. Civilization creates options, and some of those options are cruel. Now, follow the cruelty into the palace. A king sits on a stool carved or inlaid, something rare and precious. The room is cooler than the courtyard because thick walls hold back heat. A breeze comes through a doorway and carries the smell of river mud. The king's advisors stand nearby. One whispers about a rival city. Another whispers about tribute. Another whispers about the god's displeasure, perhaps shown in an eclipse, perhaps in a sickly lamb born with strange features, omens. Sumer and later Mesopotamian cultures were obsessed with omens, and I understand why. When your world is fragile, you search for signs. You look at the sky and the liver of a sacrificed sheep and the pattern of oil on water, trying to find a message that says you will be safe. But searching for signs can become a trap, because the interpretation of signs becomes power. A priest says, "The god is angry. The king must act." Act how? Build a temple. Wage a war. Offer a sacrifice. Appoint a new official. Punish a scapegoat. Sometimes, the scapegoat is a person dressed as a substitute king. There is a later Mesopotamian ritual where, when a bad omen threatens the king, a substitute is placed on the throne for a short period and then killed, taking the omen's doom with him. It's a chilling idea. A human used as a sponge for fate. Whether this exact ritual existed in early Sumer or develops later, the logic is the same, and the logic is dark. Death can be assigned. Doom can be transferred. The system can protect itself by sacrificing someone expendable. Imagine the substitute king. He might be a prisoner. He might be a servant. He might be someone chosen because his life is already considered forfeit. One day, he is bathed, dressed, fed rich food. He sits on the throne. He is called king. People bow. For a brief time, he tastes the sweetness of power, like honey on the tongue. But the sweetness is poisoned. He knows. Everyone knows. When the ritual ends, the real king returns, cleansed. The substitute is led away. The corridor is cool. The light fades. The smell changes from incense to damp stone. His footsteps echo. He hears his own breathing, fast and shallow. He wants to scream, but screaming would be useless. The system is older than his voice. This is the kind of thing that makes me feel the eerie intelligence of these cultures. They understood symbolism deeply. They knew how to shape collective fear into ritual. They also turned that fear into death, softly, efficiently, with prayers. Now, I want to ease you toward a quieter darkness. The darkness of the night watch. On the walls of a Sumerian city, guards stand. The air cools after sunset. The brick under their hands feels rough, still warm in places. Below, the city is a patchwork of lamplight. Above, the sky is dense with stars. The guard looks up. He sees the familiar patterns, the belt of a constellation, the bright wander of a planet. He might not know the mathematics, but he knows the stories. He knows the gods have stations in the sky. He shifts his weight. His joints ache. He listens. Sometimes he hears nothing but wind and distant water. Sometimes he hears a soft splash, someone moving in a canal. Sometimes he hears a whisper of reeds being parted. He tightens his grip on his spear. Because enemies exist. Thieves exist. Hunger exists. And so, in the dark, the city's systems keep working. The temple stores grain. The scribes sleep, ready to write again at dawn. The king dreams or does not dream. If you're wondering where the lost epoch fits into all this, it fits here, in the obsession with continuity, in the way the Sumerians treat knowledge as sacred cargo. In the stories, the Apkallu hide tablets in jars before the flood. They seal them with bitumen, wrap them in linen, bury them deep. They intend for them to survive water and fire and time. That image is so vivid it almost feels like a memory. A jar in a foundation trench, the smell of bitumen sharp and tar-like, hands lowering tablets carefully, a whispered prayer, then earth packed down, footsteps on top, a temple built above as if to guard the buried mind of the past. And later, after catastrophe, someone digs. Their hands are raw, nails split. Soil crumbles under fingers. A shard of pottery cuts a palm. Blood mixes with dirt. Then the jar is found. The seal cracked. The linen damp and decayed. And the tablet inside still there. Still holding wedges. Still holding instructions. If you let that scene sit in your mind, you can see why Sumerian stories blur myth and record. because the act of preserving knowledge is itself mythic. It is an act of defiance against death, but defiance has a cost. Preserving knowledge creates gatekeepers. Gatekeepers create hierarchy. Hierarchy creates suffering. So the story is circular, like the sky. Tonight, as you settle deeper, let your mind drift to a quiet room in a temple school, in Adaba, the tablet house. A boy sits cross-legged. His legs ache. His stomach growls. A teacher's voice drones, not unkind, but firm. The boy's hands are stained with clay. He practices wedges over and over, signs for grain, for sheep, for king, for God. Each press of the stylus is a tiny training in obedience. Learn the signs, learn the counts, learn the proper order. If you do, you might become a scribe. You might escape field labor. You might sit near power. You might, one day, write the name of a king into history. If you fail, you return to the mud. The boy concentrates. He presses. He makes a mistake. The teacher taps his knuckles lightly. A correction. A warning. The boy blinks tears. Not dramatic, just a sting. He keeps going. And in that small scene, you can feel the whole civilization. Knowledge as ladder. Knowledge as cage. Knowledge as lullaby. The candle in our imagined room flickers. Your breathing is slower now. The city's noise is far away, softened by time. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river moves, carrying silt, carrying memory, carrying the reflection of stars. And beneath the temple floor, perhaps, a jar sleeps with tablets inside, waiting for a future hand to find them, and to feel in their weight the same paradox, that writing can save us, and that writing can bind us. Let that paradox settle like dust, not heavy, just present, like the quiet after a long day, like the pause between one breath and the next. Tonight, I want to take you farther out than the city walls, to the place where the canals thin into marsh, where the ground stops pretending it is solid, and every step makes a quiet argument with the water. It's a strange thing how the earliest high knowledge of Sumer doesn't always feel like it belongs on dry land. So much of it is wet. Flood calendars, river omens, gods who live beneath, teachers who rise from the deep. Even the word that keeps returning, the Abzu, tastes like cold water in the mouth. Honestly, I've always felt that if you want to understand the Sumerian mind, you have to listen to water the way they did, not as scenery, as a presence, as a mood that can feed you, and then, without warning, swallow you whole. So let's stand on the reed bank at night. The air is cooler here, and it carries the smell of rot and sweetness at the same time. Decaying plants, damp mud, a faint sharpness like bruised herbs. Insects whir in uneven pulses. Frogs call, then pause, as if waiting for something to answer them from farther away. You can feel the marsh breathing, a slow rise and fall that isn't really breath, of course. It's wind moving through reeds. It's water shifting under mats of vegetation. It's the invisible motion of life everywhere, but it feels like breath anyway. And if you're tired enough, it can lull you the way a person's breathing can lull you. Now imagine a small boat more like a reed bundle, shaped into a shallow curve gliding along a narrow channel. The person inside pushes with a pole. The pole sinks into mud with a soft, reluctant sound, and each push releases tiny bubbles that pop on the surface like whispered syllables. The boat carries a man in a fish-skin cloak, or at least that's how the story will later remember him. He is Oannes, Uan, a dappa named Shift like water. In cylinder seals, in later retellings, the figure is shown with scales draped over shoulders, a fish head as a hood, a human face peering out from the mouth of the creature. Scholars debate what it means. A symbol, a priestly costume, a metaphor, and still, the image persists with stubborn clarity. A teacher from the water. I can't help it, I always feel a little unsettled by how consistent the motif is. Not because I'm desperate to believe in monsters. I'm not. It's because human imagination usually varies wildly. Yet here, across centuries, across cities, the same shape keeps surfacing, as if someone is tracing an old outline again and again. So let's treat it gently. Let's treat it like a dream that might contain a memory. The fish-cloaked teacher arrives at dawn, the story says. He comes to the people of Eridu, the first city. The city that sits like a low mound in the flatland, its temple rising above reed roofs like a dark step toward the sky. He does not come roaring. He does not demand worship. He comes as someone who understands that frightened people don't need thunder. They need repetition. He points. He shows. He takes a stick and draws lines in the sand. Straight lines, right angles, the sort of shapes that feel simple until you realize how much thought it takes to make them consistent, to make them match across distance. He shows how to set a foundation so it won't slump in rain, how to seal bricks with bitumen so water can't chew them to crumbs, how to cut canals with a gradient that keeps water moving without tearing the banks apart. These are quiet lessons, the kind that sound boring on a modern page, the kind that, in a new city on fragile ground, decide who lives. And then, the teacher sits with a scribe. The scribe is young, maybe, or maybe he is already seasoned. His fingers are strong. He has calluses where the stylus rests. He knows how to smooth clay until it looks like a small, flat moon. The teacher watches him press a sign. The sign is wrong. Not terribly wrong. Just not elegant. Not consistent. The teacher takes the stylus. This moment, to me, is the heart of the entire myth. Not a cosmic battle. Not a dramatic prophecy. Just a hand guiding another hand. The teacher presses the wedge more cleanly. He makes the angle sharper. He spaces the marks so they don't crowd. And in that spacing, that tiny discipline, the future opens. Because writing is not just language. Writing is storage. Writing is memory that can survive a broken mind. The story says the teacher taught everything. Writing, numbers, agriculture, law, ritual. It sounds like exaggeration until you remember how interlocked those things are. Teach a calendar and you teach farming. Teach measurement and you teach taxation. Teach writing and you teach the ability to enforce a rule long after the speaker is gone. It's a gift. It's also a chain. And this is where the other sages appear, the Apkallu, the seven. Each is attached to a king in the king list's deep, impossible past. Each is said to have served under an antediluvian ruler. 8 kings, 7 sages, numbers with the feel of ceremonial completeness, like a set of steps you must climb in order. In some versions, the sages are not all fish. Later iconography shows bird-headed figures too, winged and tall, holding a bucket and a pine cone. Scholars often interpret these as purification tools. Sprinkle water, touch the cone to a sacred tree, bless. But even the blessing has an eerie practicality. Purification is hygiene. Hygiene is survival. Ritual can be a way of teaching habits that keep disease at bay without ever needing to explain germs. You know that feeling, right? When something in an old custom turns out to be oddly sensible, like the ancestors didn't know what we know, but they knew enough to stay alive. So the sages teach, and the cities grow, and kingship solidifies like clay drying. Then the flood arrives. In the king list, it's one line, then the flood swept over. I always find that line more frightening than any detailed description, because a single line suggests the scribe didn't need to explain it. Everyone already knew. The flood was not entertainment. It was a boundary in time. Now, let me bring you closer to that boundary. Imagine the days before the water rises. The sky is heavy, not stormy yet, just wrong. A pale haze, like breath held too long. Birds behave strangely. They cluster, then scatter. The air smells metallic, like distant rain mixing with river silt. People notice. They talk about it in low voices. They glance toward the river more often. The river is usually familiar. predictable in its seasonal swelling. But this feels different. The water has a restless surface. It pushes against the banks with a subtle impatience. A priest climbs the temple steps with an offering. He carries a small bowl of oil and grain. He recites words he's recited before, but his voice shakes just a little, and he hates himself for it. He wants to be steady. He wants to reassure, yet his own skin feels prickly, as if the air itself is warning him. A king sits in his chamber and listens to reports. Canal gates leaking, levees softening, a crack in a dike where water has begun to seep through like a slow thought turning dangerous. He orders repairs. He orders labor. Men carry baskets of mud to patch the weak places. Their feet sink in the saturated ground. Every step makes a sucking sound. Their muscles burn. And still, the water keeps coming. The flood hero Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim in later epics receives a warning. In the oldest telling, Enki whispers through a reed wall. I love that detail. Not a booming voice from clouds, a whisper through reeds, the kind of sound you might miss if you weren't listening. Build, the whisper says. Preserve. So he builds a vessel, not a sleek ship. A big, awkward, tar-sealed box of survival. The smell of bitumen is everywhere, thick and headachy. Workers smear it on seams with bare hands. It sticks to their skin. It stains everything black. They drag animals aboard, goats, sheep, perhaps birds in cages. The animals resist, their hooves clacking on wet wood. People carry sacks of seed, clay jars of dried food, tools wrapped in cloth, little things that look insignificant until you realize they are the difference between starting again and starving. Somewhere, in a temple foundation, jars are buried. This is the part of the myth that refuses to leave my mind. Knowledge hidden in the earth as water approaches. Imagine the night of that burial. The temple courtyard is almost empty. The usual chatter is gone. The air is damp. A torch flickers, throwing nervous light. A few scribes and priests kneel beside a trench. The earth is already muddy. Their knees soak through. They hold tablets, star charts, formulas, ritual instructions, lists of measures. The tablets are wrapped in linen, the linen smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. A priest murmurs a prayer. Not theatrical, just desperate. Let this survive. They lower the tablets into a jar. The jar is sealed with bitumen, smooth and dark. The smell rises, sharp and ancient. It feels like sealing a wound. Then they cover it. Hands scoop mud. The mud is cold. It clings under nails. They pack it down. They press. They smooth. Then they stand. And for a moment, they look at the flat ground as if they can already see the future layers of debris above it. They don't say much. What can you say? The world is ending. And then the water arrives, and it does what water does when it becomes a god. It lifts. It pushes. It erases lines. It eats walls. It turns streets into currents. It makes the city's careful right angles meaningless. People climb higher. Roofs. Temple steps. They cling to reed mats. They hold children to their chests so tightly that later the children will remember the bruises as a strange kind of comfort. The sound is everywhere. Rushing. Cracking. Shouting. Then, as buildings collapse, there is a new sound, the heavy final sigh of things sinking. And then, after enough loss, there is quiet. A quiet, broken only by water lapping and the occasional call of a bird that is searching for land. That quiet is the cruelest part, because in the quiet, survivors realize what has happened. They look at the flat, endless water and feel their minds trying to split apart. Before, after. Days pass. The water recedes. Mud remains. Mud everywhere. Thick, sucking mud that makes walking exhausting. The smell is sour with decay. Dead reeds. Dead animals. Silt crusting on everything. Survivors step onto land that looks like a new world, but feels like a grave. They begin again. And this is where the sages, in some traditions, are gone, swept away, or returned to the deep, or ascended. The teachers vanish at the moment when the students must become teachers. That is, in my opinion, the gentlest cruelty built into the myth. Guidance is temporary. Responsibility is permanent. So the survivors dig. They dig in temple ruins. They dig in places the old priests told them to dig. Their hands blister. The sun beats down. Their mouths taste of dust and grief. Then, one day, a jar is found. The bitumen seal is still there, dark, intact. Someone cracks it with a stone. The sound is small, like breaking bread. Inside, the linen is damp, but the tablets have survived. They lift one. It is heavy. It holds the coolness of buried earth. The wedges on it catch light. The wedges look like tracks left by a bird in wet sand. Tiny, precise, patient. In that moment, the myth becomes almost unbearably human to me, because you can imagine the relief, the shaking laughter, the sob that comes out like a cough, the realization that not everything was lost, not the city. The city is gone, but the pattern has survived. And so, as the new Sumer rises, it rises with memory as its scaffolding. Not perfect memory, not complete, but enough. Enough to build canals again, enough to count in 60s again, enough to look at the stars and say, we used to know you. And if you let that thought settle, you might feel something calming under the darkness. Because the flood story is terrifying, yes, but it is also a story of preservation, of gentle stubbornness, of humans refusing to let the world end completely. Now, as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the marsh again, quiet in moonlight. The reeds sway, the water glints. Somewhere, a fish breaks the surface with a soft plop, then disappears, and you can almost picture a figure moving through the shallow's fish-skin cloak, trailing water, teaching, then slipping back into the deep, not to haunt you, to remind you that even in the darkest resets, someone, somewhere, tries to carry a little light forward. Just a little, enough to begin. I like to linger there, right at the edge of that water, because the edge is where the mind softens. You hear the distant crackle of reeds rubbing together. You feel a cool draft slide across your forehead, and for a second, your own thoughts slow down, as if they're moving through mud too. If you breathe in, you can almost taste the river minerals, iron and clay, and if you breathe out, it feels as though you're giving something heavy back to the night. There is a moment, late in the night, when the fire stops crackling in bursts and begins to speak in a softer language, a steady hiss, a slow settling of wood into ember, the kind of sound that doesn't demand attention, it simply accompanies your breathing. If you listen long enough, it feels like the room is remembering you, the way warm stones remember heat after a sun has left them. That's the mood I want for the final stretch of our walk through Sumer's shadows, because by now, if you've been following with me through reeds and temples and jars buried beneath foundations, you can feel the story's true shape. It isn't just about whether the first kings were literal immortals. It isn't even only about a flood. It's about what humans do when they suspect they are not the first to stand on a shore and look into darkness. They build, they record, they preserve, they tell stories that are part warning, part lullaby. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think the question, was there a lost epoch, has a clean answer we can tuck into a box and label. I've read the cautious arguments, and they have weight. Soil erodes, settlements vanish, coastlines drown. Absence is not proof of anything except absence. And yet, I've also felt the stubborn pull of the oddities, a language that stands alone, numbers that arrive already disciplined, star records that feel too calm, too practiced for a supposed first attempt. A king list that treats impossible ages with the same bureaucratic sobriety it treats grain. So tonight, I want to stand with you in that narrow middle place, the place of maybe, not the frantic maybe of conspiracy, the gentle maybe of humility. Let's return to the king list one last time. Picture it as an object, a clay tablet, not large, perhaps the size of a book. It sits in a museum display now, behind glass. Bright lights above it, a label, a catalog number. People pass by, their footsteps muffled by modern carpet. But if you let yourself ignore the museum for a moment, you can imagine the original context. A dim room, lamplight, the smell of oil and damp clay. A scribe hunched over, shoulders tense, stylus in hand. The scribe copies, not as a poet, but as a clerk. Each sign must be right. Each number must match the source. He writes, after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu. That first phrase is so strange. Descended, not, was chosen, not, arose, not, was invented, descended, like rain, like a stone dropped from a hand you cannot see. Sometimes I think that word is the entire lost epoch hypothesis in a single breath. Descended means it came from somewhere else, maybe from gods, maybe from survivors, maybe from a priestly tradition older than any one city, or maybe it simply means the Sumerians wanted kingship to feel inevitable, sacred, untouchable. Both can be true, in different ways. Then the list gives names. Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana. The syllables are like little stones in the mouth, heavy, ancient. When you say them slowly, you can almost hear the river behind them. And then, the rain lengths, tens of thousands of years. I won't pretend those numbers don't make my skin prickle. They do, because they are not written like a joke. They are written like accounting, like certainty. So, what are we supposed to do with that? One approach is to treat it as symbolism, numbers as cosmological cycles, a priestly way of describing a golden age. Perhaps those reigns compress dynasties into a single name. Perhaps they encode sacred numerology in base 60. That is reasonable. It is careful. Another approach is to treat it as memory, not literal, but rooted, a blurred recollection of a time before catastrophe, when humans lived differently, organized differently, measured time differently, a time that, after a flood, could only be described through exaggeration because the raw truth felt impossible, that is, less provable, but emotionally coherent. Trauma stretches time. Loss makes the past feel enormous. And when I think of flood survivors, I think of how a single terrible night can last 1,000 years inside the mind. So perhaps, in a way, the king list is telling the truth, not about biology, about feeling, about the way before becomes immeasurably long when after is shattered. Now, there is one more figure we haven't lingered with enough tonight. The king himself, not the mythic king, but the role. In Sumer, kingship is not just power, it is a vessel. The king is the person who holds the pattern, the one who reenacts the old order so it doesn't slip away. He is crowned not only with authority, but with obligation. And obligations can be dark, because if you are the vessel of cosmic order, then failure is not personal. Failure is apocalyptic. Imagine a king waking before dawn. The room is still. The last coals in a brazier glow faintly. A servant sleeps in a corner, curled like a child. Outside, the city is quiet except for distant dogs and the occasional clatter of a pot from an early baker. The king sits up. His body aches. He is not young, or perhaps he is young, but already tired in the way rulers become tired quickly. He rubs his eyes. He listens. He listens for water, not because he is thirsty, but because water is fate here. Too little and the fields die. Too much and the fields drown. Water is blessing. Water is curse. He dresses, linen against skin, a heavy cloak, sandal straps pulled tight. Each small action is deliberate, because in a palace, everything is watched. Even the way you breathe becomes a lesson for others. He walks through corridors where carved bricks depict lions, gods, reeds, rosettes. The symbols surround him like reminders. You are not just a man. You are a link. He steps outside. The air is cool. It smells of mud, smoke, and something sweet, date palms perhaps. He looks up. The stars. You can picture them above the flat land, unobstructed, endless. Stars are the most stable thing he knows. They do not care about his politics. They do not care about his fear. They turn, night after night, and their turning can be measured. This is why astronomy becomes sacred, not because ancient people were naive, but because the sky is dependable when the earth is not. The king watches the horizon for a certain rising, a certain bright point. He counts under his breath. His lips move without sound. He has been taught the sequence since childhood, the way some children are taught prayers. And if he gets it wrong, if the calendar drifts, if the festivals misalign, if the planting is mistimed, hunger follows. This is the dark backbone beneath the beauty. Sumer's sophistication is not decorative. It is survival engineering in a world of thin margins. Now, bring your attention back to those buried jars. I keep thinking about them because they are the most tender act in the entire story. To bury knowledge is to admit you might die. It's to accept that your city might vanish. It's also to refuse to let your mind vanish with it. That refusal is what later civilizations inherit. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. Each one conquers, each one destroys, each one builds, and each one still copies. Sumerian signs, still reveres old words, still calls certain texts from before the flood. There's something almost mournful in that. The conqueror, so proud, still kneeling to copy the older script, like a child tracing the handwriting of a parent long gone. It makes me think that the lost epoch doesn't have to be a single, grand, Atlantis-like civilization to matter. It could be smaller, coastal settlements drowned by sea rise, regional networks forgotten under silt, pockets of knowledge that survived in stubborn people. Or it could be myth alone. But even myth does something real. It teaches you to preserve, and that might be the quietest, darkest lesson of all. Because it implies the world can end again. It implies you should be ready, not with panic, with jars, with songs, with stories pressed into clay. Before we close the door completely, let me take you to one more place, a place that belongs to our time, not theirs. Imagine a diver, not the heroic kind from movies, just a patient person in a wetsuit, breathing through a regulator that clicks and sighs, lowering into cold green water where sunlight turns to dim ribbons. The sea is never truly silent down there. It hums. It crackles with tiny shrimp. It thumps with your own heartbeat trapped inside rubber and glass. The diver follows a sonar map, a grid of coordinates, numbers. Again, always numbers. Down on the seafloor, sand ripples like wrinkles. Fish scatter. The diver's gloved hand brushes away silt, and for a second a straight edge appears stone, perhaps, or a natural shelf that only looks like stone. That only looks like is where so much of this debate lives. Some shapes underwater are made by humans. Some are made by patient geology. Sometimes, if you're honest, you cannot tell which is which without years of careful work, and even then, you might still be wrong. I think about that uncertainty a lot. The way the ocean keeps its secrets by simply being vast. The way it can cover a whole coastline and make it vanish from our story as easily as a blanket pulled over a sleeping child. And I can almost picture ancient people standing on a shoreline as it crept forward, year after year, a little higher, a little more salt in the soil, a little more fear in the voice when they spoke about the old place now swallowed. If there was ever a coastal culture, small, not magical, just organized enough to build and measure and teach, then rising water would have been the most brutal teacher of all. It would have forced migration. It would have forced loss. It would have turned expertise into myth, because the teachers would arrive inland as strangers with strange skills, and the inland people would do what humans always do when they meet something they don't understand. They make it sacred. That, to me, is the most plausible bridge between sober archaeology and shimmering legend. Not gods from the stars, not a perfect Atlantis, just refugees with knowledge, and a world that had no language for refugee engineer. So it said sage, it said divine, it said from the deep. When you hold that possibility in your palm, it feels neither ridiculous nor certain. It feels like a smooth pebble warmed by the sun, real, but impossible to trace back to the exact river that shaped it. And in a way, the Sumerians themselves model that posture. They don't scream their origins. They don't try to prove them. They simply write them down, quietly, stubbornly, as if to say, this is what we were told. This is what we remember. This is what we refuse to lose. That refusal is what I keep returning to, like a hand returning to a familiar stitch in cloth. Now, as we reach the end, I want to slow everything down even more. Imagine you are a scribe, long after the flood, long after the first cities have rerouted. You sit in a small room, near a temple. The floor is packed earth. The walls are brick, cool to the touch. A faint smell of incense lingers, mixed with the plain smell of clay. You have a bowl of water beside you. Not much, just enough to keep the clay workable. Your fingers dip in it occasionally. The water is cold. It wakes the skin. A lamp burns with a small flame. The flame flickers when you breathe. You lift a fresh tablet. It is damp, heavy, smooth. You hold the stylus. You begin to write. Each wedge is a tiny cut into softness. Each wedge is a decision. Press, lift, shift, press again. The sound is quiet. A soft tick, a soft scrape. You write a king's name, then a number, then another city. Outside, the world is dark. A dog barks once, then stops. The river murmurs like an old voice in another room. And you feel, in a way you cannot fully explain, that you are doing more than recording. You are keeping a thread from snapping. That feeling of being a keeper of thread might be the most human thing I know. It's the same feeling a parent has when they tell a child a story at night. The same feeling a grandmother has when she teaches a recipe. The same feeling you may have had when you saved an old photo you couldn't bear to lose. So when I speak tonight of floods and lost epochs and kings who ruled impossibly long, I'm also speaking of that ordinary tenderness, memory as an act of care. And now, if your eyes are heavy, let them be heavy. If your shoulders are tense, let them sink. Picture the marsh again, but calm this time. Moonlight on black water, reeds whispering. A distant temple mound, barely visible, like a sleeping animal on the horizon. The stars turn slowly overhead, indifferent and faithful. The old teacher in the fish-skin cloak has already gone back into the deep, and the city is quiet, and the jars are buried, and somewhere, in the soft dark, a scribe's last wedge dries in clay. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. It's enough to let the mystery rock you the way water rocks a boat. It's enough to let the ancient silence settle like dust in a beam of candlelight. And as you drift, gently, down and down into sleep, I'll leave you with the simplest, oldest blessing a storyteller can offer, spoken softly, like a hand smoothing your hair in the dark. Good night.